Hello everyone, this is Ms. Schaefer to go through food chains and food webs with you all. Organisms need energy to survive, and their role is determined by how they get that energy and interact with other organisms. So, for example, an organism may be a producer, like a plant, a consumer, like a rabbit, or a decomposer, like a mushroom. Producers are organisms that make their own food through photosynthesis. Plants are producers because they produce their own food. So all of the energy originates with the sunlight in environments. Plants add that with carbon dioxide and water, go through photosynthesis and create glucose, which is their food, and also oxygen. Consumers are organisms that have to consume or eat other plants and animals in order to get energy to survive because they cannot make their own food. There are different types of consumers based on what they eat, such as carnivores, which are animals that eat mainly meat, such as lions and eagles and spiders. There are also herbivores, which are animals that eat mainly plants, such as deer and rabbits and cows. And then there are omnivores, which are animals that are able to eat plants and animals, such as humans, most bears, and seagulls. Decomposers are an important part of the ecosystem because they are organisms that break down dead organisms and waste, and then they recycle or release those nutrients back into the environment. So sometimes you will see examples such as this one that include the decomposers over here and remind us that the sunlight is where all that energy originates from. So it transfers to the producers, they make their own food, it goes through all of these organisms that eat each other, and then the decomposer recycle those nutrients back to the environment. Energy enters the ecosystem as sunlight, and then the producers convert that into their food energy. When organisms eat the producers, that energy is transferred to them, and then organisms that feed on those organisms then transfer the energy to them. So the movement of that energy through an ecosystem can be shown in diagrams called food chains and food webs. So on the left here is an example of a food chain. You can see it's just one straight line that shows us that the producer is eaten by this organism is eaten by this one, this organism is eaten by them, and then finally we end with the hawk that's eating the snake. So the food chain is just one possible path that energy can move through the environment, whereas on the right-hand side we can see a food web that shows a little bit more of a complex version and a more realistic version of how that energy may flow through the environment. So a food chain shows how an organism gets food and how that energy is transferred from organism to organism. A food chain is always going to start with a producer and then end with the animals or consumers. So in this example, the food chain starts with grass and shows that the rabbit eats the grass and the fox eats the rabbit. When you're drawing a food chain or food web, the arrow always points to the organism that's doing the eating. This demonstrates the direction of that flow of energy through the ecosystem and means is eaten by. So in this example, the acorns are eaten by the mouse to get energy, the snake is eating the mouse, and then the hawk is eating the snake. So a food chain shows one possible path where energy can move through an ecosystem, but just like we don't eat the exact same thing every day, neither do many other organisms. So a more realistic way to show this flow of energy is through a food web, which is several overlapping food chains. So food chain and web always starts with a producer. And then from there, you build to the different levels of consumers. So for example, if this is our producer, the chipmunk here is eating the producer, so that makes it a first level consumer. The fox is eating the chipmunk, so that means that they are a second level consumer. And then it builds from there. So for example, in this food chain, you start with the producer, you move to the bird, which is a first level consumer in this example. The snake would be a second level consumer, and then the hawk would be a third level consumer. If you look at other examples, you can pull out single food chains within a food web. So in this example, our producers are over here, so we have leaves and grass, and then you would build from there. So if I were to pull out one single food chain in this food web, I may start with leaves and then go to caterpillar, to snake, to owl. So there are several food chains in this food web that combine together. So you can see that some of the organisms eat more than one thing. One thing you want to keep in mind, especially with the omnivores, is that, such as in this example, the bird may be a first level consumer in this food chain because it's eating the producer, but if you follow this food chain, it's actually a second level consumer because it's eating the caterpillar. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. So to recap a few important things, remember that all energy for these food webs and food chains comes from the sunlight. They always start with a producer, and then you build from there with your different types of consumers. The arrow shows the direction of that energy flow and is always pointing to the organism that is doing the eating. So that wraps things up for food chains and food webs. I hope that helped you all.